Hey guys, welcome back. This is Professor De Angelo. We're going to go into our next section. This is the second to the last of my presentations for you guys, podcasts. So we're going into the conservative revival, or what some people refer to as the Reagan era, the 1980s, or the go-go 80s, as some people have called it. And we're going to be looking into some very long-term, critical stuff that still seems to affect a lot of us today. And so when Reagan was elected in 1980, it was largely because he promised to get America moving again. So the stagflation that we talked about was still at record levels in 1980. And he promised the American people that unlike Jimmy Carter and the Democrats, he had the answer. And the answer he supplied came to be called Reaganomics. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And so it was a combination of conservative Republican principles with a little bit of a twist. So Reagan called for reducing federal spending, which of course he never does, on domestic programs. And then he called for lowering American taxes, both on individuals and corporations. And he called for less government regulations on the economy. And so in particular, Reagan promised that by reducing taxes on the wealthy, he would actually improve the economic activity because those wealthy Americans would begin spending again. And their expenditures would revive the economy. Now, it didn't quite work out the way he thought it was going to happen. He promised part that he would spend it on military spending, and he'll go into a huge budgetary deficit in order to accomplish that. And the spin-off effects of that spending really had a lot to do with why the economy revived. So let's start with Carter. Carter didn't have the skill to negotiate the congressional paths of legislation, right? His style and the fact that he wasn't from inside Washington made him an outsider even to his own Democrats. And so he was not very successful as a political person. He's clearly a very good man and has done a lot of things in order to help the world. And yet his promise to bring that wholesomeness and that sort of down-to-earth honesty didn't play out well in Washington. And so just to give you an idea, in the picture that you see there, that's Jimmy Carter and his wife, Rosalind. They're walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. That he's just been sworn in as president, and he is walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. He did this because there was still an energy crisis going on in the United States, and the limousine that you see behind him, the presidential limousine, was a well-known gas guzzler. I want to say it only got like 10 miles to the gallon. And in the midst of all of the sort of restrictions put on people because of fuel costs and the energy shortage period, Carter felt that he needed to send a message that he, just like Jefferson, who also walked, that he was going to be a man of the people and that he was going to be more humble and less wasteful. Well, the Secret Service did not like that idea at all. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania Avenue is a rather broad street. And there had been 2 separate assassination attempts against Gerald Ford, his predecessor, in just 2 years. And the limousine, as you see there, is a hardtop. John F. Kennedy, as we all know, was assassinated in a convertible. And ever since then, presidents were not ever traveling in open-aired vehicles. And so now to have a president literally walking in the open air in a very broad avenue was just a logistical nightmare for the Secret Service. So a fight broke out between the Secret Service and the Carter people, and Carter insisted that he walk. So the compromise was that the limousine would follow behind, and you could sort of see the feet of a Secret Service agent behind the president and the first lady. And so this is the, to me, this is the sort of metaphor for the Carter administration. He's out front with this great idea, but the practical application was just never there. And so it never worked out. And so Carter and human rights, I have that up there because Carter really is the first president in American history to make human rights a foundation of his foreign policy. So he wanted to pursue this because he felt that there were universal standards. But the fact of the matter is there really weren't. And the problem with human rights still to this day is not everybody agrees what that means. And Carter really didn't have a grasp of that until he got into office and realized that there were a number of countries, most specifically China, Russia, the usual suspects, who did not acknowledge the same level of human rights, even though these countries had signed the Helsinki Accords, which you would assume meant that they understood them. They really did not. So his one singular success, again, in my opinion, is the peace treaty that he brokered between Egypt and Israel in 1978, which is referred to as the Camp David Accords. Camp David is the presidential retreat in Maryland, and Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were invited by the president to the retreat, where he essentially convinced Israel to return the Sinai Peninsula that they had captured from Egypt. They agreed to give that land back to Egypt, and Egypt agreed to sign a peace treaty with Israel, which recognized Israel's right to exist. This was a major accomplishment and established a formula for peace that is still kind of like the operating mechanism used in peace negotiations in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors, and that is what's referred to as the land for peace formula. So Israel would give up occupied territory in exchange for a peace treaty. So in theory, Israel gave Gaza to the Palestinians. The Palestinians were supposed to therefore recognize Israel's right to exist. The PLO, or the Fatah, were prepared to do that, but as you kind of know, Hamas has taken over Gaza, and they are refusing to recognize Israel's right to exist. And so we have that stalemate that goes on. And this has a lot to do with how that formula has become the sort of the standard for all the agreements, right? So Carter's greatest failure was the mismanagement of the economy. And I'm going to go off script here for this one because although I was not a fan of Mr. Carter's in terms of political support, I really honestly believe he got sort of the shaft on this assessment. I talked about this before, I believe. Stagflation was an economic reality that defied theory. We've talked about in previous podcasts about how there was a post-war consensus, and in domestic policy, Keynesian economics was going to be the foundation. Nixon followed it, Ford followed it, right? All of the presidents since FDR had followed that same principle, regardless of party. And Carter did the same thing. There were absolutely no political coalitions together at that time that would have supported anything other than Keynesian remedies. In my opinion, Carter just followed the pattern. And the problem with that was it didn't work because Keynesian economics does not recognize a reality where both unemployment and inflation would go up. These were weird realities that just happened because of conditionality. And I don't know that I think that I would ever give Carter a slap for that. I mean, he just really did what he had to do. So, however, when he left office, inflation averaged at 13% a year, which is just unbelievable. We're not at quite 2%, and people get nervous today. And so, kind of a rough one. He does end up signing a second SALT agreement that had been negotiated by Gerald Ford. It's never going to go into place, however, because the Russians are going to invade in Afghanistan in 1979. This brings us to the weirdest part of his presidency, which is the Iranian Revolution, which erupted in 1979 when fundamentalist Muslims joined to overthrow the pro-American Shah. They were led by Ayatollah Khomeini and would take the U.S. embassy. Now, here's where the book wants you need to be careful, right? The embassy was actually taken over by college students who, in the sort of fit of rage in support of the Ayatollah, started rampaging through Western embassies. And they got to the United States, and they took 52 diplomats as hostage. So if you've ever seen the movie Argo, that film is a Hollywood depiction of the actual events of some members of the diplomatic staff who were able to sneak out of the embassy during all of the melee and were basically hidden at the Canadian embassy. And so Carter appealed to the United Nations for help, but the Khomeini refused to listen. So the president launched 2 rescue attempts. Both of them failed due to helicopter problems. And this photograph of the hostages being held created a huge problem in the United States. And so we get things there. Let me back up. There are 2 things that I believe just doomed Jimmy Carter. One was the economic conditions, what's referred to as the Carter malaise. There was just high inflation and high unemployment. What happened was the media caught on to this, and I don't know who gets credit for coining it, but they started taking the unemployment rate and the inflation rate and adding it together and coming up with a number that they called the misery index. So imagine every month, whether you watched television or listened to radio or read the newspaper, every month you would hear this quote-unquote misery index. It was a constant monthly reminder of how horrible your economy was. I don't know how a president withstands that kind of monthly scrutiny and negative press. And, Carter definitely had to suffer through it. The next comes in 1979 when these hostages are taken and Carter fails to rescue them. The media start a day-to-day count, and they called it America Held Hostage. And so every day when you watched the news or read a paper or listened on the radio, they would tell you, America held hostage, day 215, right? And, I don't know how a president's ratings can stay up under those conditions. It just was never going to happen. And, Carter bears responsibility for that in part. I'm not trying to, sort of be an apologist for Jimmy Carter, but I don't know if any president could have survived that kind of scrutiny. These hostages are not going to come out until Ronald Reagan appears on the scene in 1980. And as you can see, Jimmy Carter gets shellacked. I mean, it's one of the worst showings for a sitting president, I think, probably since Taft in 1912. So Ronald Reagan comes into this malaise, if you will. And malaise is just a sense of ennui, right? This sense that every additional unit of energy is going to result in a negative unit of satisfaction or pleasure. And so he suffers from this, right? Now, there's a population shift that has been happening with people moving into places like Florida and California and Texas. And these moved those states from essentially liberal Democrat to conservative Republican. And you always want to be careful with that too, because I think contemporary minds will think differently. When the text talks about liberal Democrat or just liberal, they're talking about what I would consider to be today a moderate Democrat. there's a tendency today to see liberal and we think of a Bernie Sanders or some sort of a socialist, and that's not what the book is referencing here. The book is referencing traditional left and traditional right, which would be today they would be the sort of the moderate of either side of those spectrum. So now, this is going to be referred to as the rise of the new right. So we had the new left emerge in the 60s and 70s, and now we're going to have the new right emerging in the 80s and 90s. This is essentially a coalition of religious individuals who are part of a movement that actually started in the 70s. This was a group of what are called televangelists, right? So these are pastors who go on television and preach the gospel. They get enormous followings of people who donate money to their efforts. They become multi-million-dollar enterprises. But more significantly to the idea of the new right is that they tap into this silent majority that Nixon had talked about. And one of the televangelists, a man named Jerry Falwell, will rename the silent majority and call it the moral majority. So Nixon always talked about how the average American was this silent majority that, didn't complain, didn't protest, didn't do anything, didn't have arguments, but on election night would quietly go into the voting booth and vote, in this case, Republican. Well, Falwell believed that not only were they silent, but they were moral. Their silence was based on a moral ethic that they held and that they would hold other people accountable to. And now, what made that significant for Reagan, even though he himself was not what I would call a very, practicing religious person. In fact, he was divorced and remarried. The idea here was that these televangelists possessed mailing lists of literally millions and millions of registered voters. And so on election day, they could mobilize literally millions of people. And if you've ever engaged persons who are evangelical in their religious faith, you find that once they are convinced that something's right, they will be committed. And it wasn't just money, it wasn't just votes, it was also feet. These people would go out into the streets and hand out flyers and hold meetings and volunteer in voting booths. I mean, they stuffed envelopes, they did all the things that you needed, right? They were the foot soldiers for some of this. Now, they're the new element here. There was always the traditional right wing in American politics. These would be people who are for low taxes, which in this case was a movement in California called the Prop 13. There were individuals who believed in small government, which today would be sort of like a libertarian. These are people who followed Barry Goldwater, who was a close political ally of Reagan's. So there's all different types of people in this coalition. And so part of this was this anti-feminist backlash. There were a number of conservative women who felt left out by the emerging Marxist principles of the feminist movement, particularly when it came to things like abortion, contraception, and things like that. So part of the Reagan coalition is going to be these conservative women who rejected, what I guess we would call radical feminism. Your text probably takes that a little bit differently. That's my take on it. So Reagan goes out to promote more conservative ideas. And he believed that the government was not the solution to economic problems. In fact, the malaise was really created by government. And I would say that's kind of true. America's policies, as I said earlier, were following a Keynesian model were following Keynesian ideas for an economic problem that Keynesian theorists didn't even contemplate. So, however, previous presidents had failed to address the issue, so Reagan had some relevance to that, I guess. But Reagan pushed through a series of bills that cut income taxes, and that was across the board, something like 30% cut in taxes, and capital gains taxes, which is monies that are earned from investments, and made other concessions to revitalize the population. So by doing so, he returned money to the richest Americans. Now, your book clearly shows a bias here, and I'm going to try to balance it, if you will. So the text will talk about how, you gave all this money to the richest Americans and then more to spend on items that they like to buy. This raised demand, which created jobs, right? Now, this is called supply-side economics. So I wanted to just go over this for just a little bit. So Keynesian economics was a principle that was articulated by John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s that was really sort of the foundational principle of the New Deal. In it, if you follow the theory, when an economy goes into a negative downfall, and that means 2 quarters of negative growth, then government, according to Keynes, needed to substitute for the lack of demand in the economy. In other words, consumers and investors were no longer spending their money. They were hiding their money. That's why it's called, they're hibernating. That's why they call it a bear market. So to Keynes, the government has to step in order to substitute for the missing demand. And they did that through borrowing money, lowering interest rates, and building public works projects. So it could be as complicated as a series of dams that are built in order to control flooding and generate electricity, or it could be as simple as hiring people to go out and sweep streets and rake leaves and do those sorts of things, right? It's the whole gambit of those things. Why? Well, if these people are being laid off from the factory, you give them a substitute job, and the theory is they don't stop being consumers and investors. So the demand remains constant. Well, there's a number of reasons why that doesn't necessarily work. In the case of the New Deal, it didn't work because the injection of government spending didn't happen after 2 quarters of negative growth. It happened after almost 3 years after negative growth. And so it doesn't have the same stimulant effect that even Keynes would have argued would have been proper. The problem in the 80s was that people were being laid off from jobs that were not going to occur anymore. These were what I refer to as job displacement. So people were not being laid off; they were being let go, and so that's a different problem. And so Keynesian models don't work, right? So now Milton Friedman is credited for the theory called supply-side economics, the Chicago School of Economics, and the University of Chicago economists is following kind of what some people refer to as the Austrian School of Economics. And in it, he believed that the government should actually not try to substitute demand, but to substitute supply of capital. So now, another downfall, I guess, on Keynesian economics is that the government, because it's doing the spending, the government decides where money goes. And so they are, in a sense, picking winners and losers. They're deciding which industries get help, which people get help, and which people or industries don't get help. Friedman believed that was not only bad economics, but it was bad politics. It was in a sense, taking away the freedom of people to have their money go where they wanted it to go, rather than where a government said it was going to go. And so this meant that everybody in the country that pays taxes should get more of their money back every paycheck, not just a rebate that comes at the end of the year that they then go on a little sort of spree, but every single paycheck. And that's why Reagan cut the rates of taxes all the way across the board. Your textbook makes it sound as though if you were a poor person and paid taxes that you didn't get any money. Well, that's just not correct. If you were a taxpayer, your rates got cut by 30%. It's just that the wealthiest people, when their taxes were cut 30%, they had a much larger windfall of cash. And that was by design. Why? Because us little people, right? Us poor working class people, we get maybe an extra $300 a month. So what does that do for us? Well, we might go out and go away for a weekend, or we may take that $300 and, go out and buy some really nice things for the house. Or we might sit there and go, wow, I got an extra $300 a month. I think I'll go buy that car, right? Well, a big investor, right? A big taxpayer, a wealthy person, they're going to get thousands of dollars every month. And they don't just go out and buy things. They buy stocks, they buy bonds, they buy U.S. bonds, they buy all sorts of things that have a much larger spin-off effect on the economy. And so this is, in Friedman's opinion, the better way to stimulate the economy. And the reason for that is Friedman believed that when consumers are picking winners and losers, then that means the money's going into long-term viable economic operations. And so the likelihood of a recovery lasting longer was better in a supply side model than in a Keynesian model. And I will go over this again later when we talk about Obama. So these conservative ideas get out there, and it's going to be referred to as Reaganomics. Critics of the system are going to call it trickle-down economics, which was a term used to discredit Hoover in 1932. So now, here's where I just 100% agree with historians. Reagan decided he was going to, quote-unquote, balance the budget. In fact, he pledged people that he would support a balanced budget amendment. And so he does go after some spending, but it's almost all on domestic issues, and it's on people who were probably the neediest in the country. And so this is going to create a liberal backlash because it's going to seem like a very one-sided thing. And I would have to say that on a large degree, that's correct. I mean, he did not show, in my opinion, the same kind of enthusiasm and support for issues of social matter and for issues dealing or helping the poor than he did for military and foreign policy. I don't see how you can argue that necessarily. But the liberal backlash really didn't work. Even with a recession, Reagan was able to win re-election in 1984 by a landslide. Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, was the nominee in 1984. And I just got to tell you, as a person who was voting for the first time, Mondale was about as exciting as a sack of wet mice. I mean, that guy was just a real yawner. And so I want to say that Mondale maybe I know he took his home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia, and he may have taken Hawaii and a couple of other states, but that's it. I mean, Reagan really sailed to victory. But as you can see by these pictures, there was a sizable group of people both for and against Reagan. He was what I would call a divisive person in how he set up government. So this is, just the numbers are the numbers. However, on electoral basis, Reagan dominated. He was just a larger than life figure. And even today, I think a lot of liberal historians will still kind of concede, yeah, the guy really did do quite a bit, right? So now, Reagan's foreign policy was essentially based on the theme of peace through strength. And what he did is he initiated a dramatic buildup of nuclear and conventional weapons. And this is a massive defensive buildup. It is the largest one that I can think of in peacetime in American history, to be honest. And so Reagan essentially believed that the Soviet Union was what he called the evil empire. And this is a reference that's actually kind of comical because the most famous movie series at the time were the Star Wars films that had come out in the late 70s and the early 80s. And Reagan is a Hollywood man, and he just, he just goes for it. And it's almost hokey in its narrative, really. But Reagan believed that the Soviet Union had to be pushed into what he called the dustbin of history. And those are very combative words. But Reagan vehemently opposed the policy of détente. And if you remember, détente, started by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, was the belief that, in a world of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had to work together and to tolerate one another, and so that we could have relative peace. And by peace, we mean order, right? That all wars remain local and under control and limited. Reagan believed that was nonsense. And he believed that the Soviet Union was on its knees. And when it's on its knees, you might as well just kick it in the teeth. And he's going to undergo about a $2 trillion debt of spending. And I'll give you my assessment of that later. But at the time, it caused all kinds of turmoil, both domestically and around the world. And, Reagan... Reagan was able to essentially force the country and the world, the West at least, to tolerate this massive buildup. I mean, he's going to completely replace the nuclear arsenal with upgraded nuclear missiles, both at the intermediate and long range, or ICBM, levels. And I mean, it was just an unbelievable amount of spending. The European allies initially refused to take the intermediate missiles. They did not want this upgrade. And Reagan essentially told them, well, if you're not going to go on board with this, I'm going to pull the troops out of Europe. And there were massive demonstrations in Europe against the United States. Whenever people in the media tell me that, today, the world hates Americans more today than ever before, I think, no. I was in Europe in 1980. People hated Europe. People hated Americans. Bad. It was really bad. Now, closer to home, Central America was rife with communist activity. So places like El Salvador, where communist-supported forces had been attempting to overthrow the elected government since 1980. Reagan's going to dispatch military advisors and funds to prevent the overthrow of the government. This did not have the intended effect, as the revolutionaries used this to their advantage and won control of the nation. So in Nicaragua, Reagan empowered the Central Intelligence Agency to train and supply anti-communist rebels to fight against the Soviet and Cuban armed government there. A guy named Ortega, who is today president of Nicaragua, and he's a problem again. Now, in the Middle East, the Islamic civil war between the nations of Iran and Iraq. Afghanistan had been invaded by the Soviets in 1979. And the Soviets were becoming increasingly bogged down in their own version of Vietnam. And Israeli troops pushed the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. They pushed them out of Lebanon. They literally invaded and put it in there. And the U.S. is going to send peacekeepers there, along with Britain, France, and Italy. And it's an absolute disaster. The United States military personnel were put in under UN command for their peacekeeping efforts there. And in October of 1983, which is really in the early part of October, a suicide bomber, an Islamic suicide bomber, drove a truck of explosives into the Marine barracks, killing 241 Marines. And Reagan decided to withdraw all of our forces from the area. And you would think that that would have been a disaster, but Reagan personally went to Dover Air Force Base and welcomed those bodies back to the United States, and spoke directly and apologized to families and took all this stuff onto his own and gave a speech that was televised. And you could, whether it was acting or not, his eyes were watering and he seemed choked up at times. And his popularity ratings actually went up, prompting people to call him the Teflon president, which is a term that's going to also be used for Bill Clinton. So, also, and this is really a very Reagan-esque response to defeat, Reagan responded to pleas from neighboring nations of Grenada in the Caribbean to dispose a communist government there that had overthrown a previous regime. Once again, Marines were sent in, and in a very lopsided battle, I think the whole thing took like 3 hours. It was like a D-Day invasion of a parking lot. I mean, it's just unbelievable, overwhelming deals. But the United States was victorious and was able to get things sort of in our advantage. The Cubans and the Soviets had sponsored Grenada's government and were building an airstrip there and a sort of an arsenal stockpile of weapons. And from that island, they were going to basically ship weapons to communist guerrilla groups to places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala, but also as far away as Angola, where a huge war was happening there as well, or communist fight. So now, at this point, the Soviet Union is going to get a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And in Reagan's first term, the Soviet Union was suffering what I would just call geriatric crisis. Brezhnev died. He was replaced by a guy named Chernenko. Chernenko died. He was replaced by a guy named Andropov. He died. And so, in fact, when a reporter made a remark to Reagan as to, why hasn't he at least tried to have a talk with a Soviet leader rather than all this military buildup? Why not have a summit? And Reagan said, well, who am I supposed to meet with? They're all dying on me, right? And it was true. Well, Gorbachev was in his 50s. He was probably the youngest of all of the leaders. And he wanted to pursue a détente so that he could fix Russia's economic problems. So the Russian economy was suffering really from the same problems that the U.S. economy was suffering from, a stagnation, if you will. But because they didn't embrace capitalist principles, there was no way for them to revive. So you saw in Russia a level of economic repression that Americans could only imagine in their worst nightmare. And so people were waiting in lines for hours in order to get toilet paper. They would only, you literally had to buy, if you needed a pair of shoes, you bought whatever size they had and you made them work. I mean, that's how bad it was. I mean, you would wait for hours to get into a bakery only to find out the shelves were empty. I mean, this is the kind of horrible stuff that went on. And so what happens is Reagan comes up with this program referred to as the Strategic Defense Initiative, what is critics called Star Wars. And have you ever seen the the Austin Powers movies, right? When he talks about, I want sharks with laser beams attached to them, it's a reference to SDI. So Star Wars was envisioned as a space-based laser system that would detect a launch of a Soviet ICBM and literally explode it while it was in space before it could re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, which would therefore render them basically useless. And Reagan, and I still don't know if it's true or not, but apparently Ronald Reagan really believed that this was going to be doable, that we were going to be able to do this. and essentially decided that he's going to spend a few $1 billion on this technology. Gorbachev thought that this was a nightmare for the Soviet Union because, as Reagan believed, the Soviet economy could not endure another arms race. The Soviets would simply not be able to keep up with the United States. And he therefore tried to find out exactly what was going on. And Soviet spies infiltrated all parts of the Western Alliance and could not find a source for the information on this. And so Gorbachev meets with Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, Iceland. And when Reagan makes this kind of off-the-cuff remark of, why don't we just get rid of all these weapons? Gorbachev said, why don't we? And all the diplomats there and all the interpreters there are just sort of shocked. And they sit down, they start negotiating, and Gorbachev says, look, we could do this, but you have to give up SDI. And Reagan said, no. And Gorbachev gets up and walks out, blames Reagan, this sort of, I can't remember what he called him, something like medieval goon squad or something. I can't remember what the reference, but he made, and walked off. And the entire world was just furious with Reagan. A chance to just get rid of weapons, and why did you do that? And it was a nightmare, drag out thing. But Reagan's bluff worked. And here's the thing. There was no SDI program. It was all stuff on the drawing boards. There were no real significant tests happening. There was no bombs ready to go. There was no laser beams ready to send into space. The whole thing was just in Reagan's head and in the dreams of some like sci-fi filmmakers or probably Star Wars fans. And so these spies are out there looking for something that didn't exist, but the more they looked and couldn't find it, the more serious they thought it was. And so Gorbachev meets with Reagan again, and they negotiated what's referred to as the INF Treaty. This eliminated intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. So all those weapons that Reagan forced Western Europeans to take onto their soil, he now took away. This is tens of billions of dollars in money, if not hundreds of billions, really, and they're just gone. And Reagan was not only able to get them to take away these weapons, but he got them to agree to verification. His famous "trust but verify" line gets embraced by Gorbachev, and this is followed up in 1987. With the START 1 treaty. So START stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or Strategic Arm Reduction Treaty. And this was the first time that the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to lessen their ICBMs. So instead of limiting them, they started to destroy them. And this was all done with observers to verify that, in fact, the material had been stored safely and that the missiles themselves had been dismantled. It was just such a phenomenal thing. Now, Reagan's second term, however, starts to unravel within the middle of that term. So reports began to circulating about illicit arms sales to Iran in exchange for Iran working to secure American hostages in Lebanon. So money from these sales, which were not permitted, were found in Latin America, where anti-communist fighters in Nicaragua called the Contras were in need of weapons. So eventually the charges were proven true, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was an aide to the National Security Council, was discovered as the ringleader of this plan. And further investigation proved that members of Reagan's administration had known about the plan, and North was fired. He was convicted, but the judgment was overturned on appeal. And I want to go over this a little bit because I think that the book gets a little too cute by half. This is a very good lesson that I think would be advisable for the Democrats in 2019. There was a there. but they couldn't make the connection to Reagan. But in their obsession to get at Reagan, who they couldn't touch politically, but they figured, ooh, we have a smoking gun, let's get rid of him legally, in a sense, they decided to just go after him with all their gusto. So in order to get Reagan in their snare, they offered Oliver North and his secretary, Fawn Hall, full immunity, meaning any information that he gave to the Congress in his testimony could not be used against him in a court of law. This is why his conviction was overturned on appeal, because that evidence was in fact used by prosecutors to try to get him convicted. And an appeals court revealed that you couldn't do that. He was offered immunity, and therefore it is excluded information, something called the exclusionary rule. And this is a complete muck-up by the Democrats because, as I just said, North comes before the Congress. He's in his full military uniform and all of his medals that he received for heroism, and he basically confesses to the whole thing. And when they ask him if the president knew about it, he says, well, I don't know. I assume he knew. I mean, it was going. I assume it went up the chain of command, but this is what we did, and this is how we did it, and da-da-da-da-da. And he essentially fell on his sword. And I don't know if he was covering for the president or if he really honestly didn't know whether the president knew. But the fact of the matter is both he and his secretary confessed to these issues, and neither of them were able to be convicted. Meanwhile, they had nothing on Reagan directly. And this is basically a nightmare for the Democrats. The turmoil in Central America then continued until 1988 when the Nicaraguan president, Daniel Noriega, negotiated a ceasefire with the Contras. And he'll later leave office. He'll be thrown out of office, only to return again when being elected into office, which just totally blew my mind, to be honest. And he's still there, and he's refusing to leave, which shouldn't surprise anyone. Now, in addition to that, we had sort of changing social landscape that goes in there, which really had a lot to do with the Green Movement and the computer revolution that sort of happens. Now, the Green Movement is somewhat interesting, and I think it's important to understand that the Green Movement at the time had got started on issues that probably don't even ring a bell to most young people today. It was an anti-nuclear message, which in fact led to the Green Party being created in Europe, and now, of course, there's a Green Party in the United States. So it started off as an anti-nuclear movement, and then in the United States, it latched onto something called acid rain, and this was from particularly the burning of coal, but also the use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that when those particles go into the atmosphere, they stay into the clouds, and when the rain comes, they pick up those particles and drop it on trees and other plants. And it was literally burning trees, and so that was the big movement that came out of that. In the computer industry, so in 1971, we get the invention of the silicon chip, which led to the computer age. And so Bill Gates and Ed Roberts are going to be credited for leading what we call the personal computing revolution. And obviously it transforms the entire marketplace and the economy. And so if I go back to the supply side economics, one of the reasons why it works for Reagan, which of course, he had no way of knowing, but when all these Americans, both rich and poor, had this little bit of extra money, here were all these new cool products that are on the market, namely personal computers. I mean, it was just the thing. And so this really took on a big deal. So this is what's very important, though, right? And during Reagan's administration, the federal debt tripled. So savings among Americans were at an all-time low because everybody's out there just spending money and going into more debt. And on October 19th, 1987, what's called Black Monday, the stock market crashed. And although it was it was actually worse than 1929 crash, automatic safeguards enacted since then prevented the worst from occurring. So the next thing that kind of comes into play is just a combination of horribleness, really. The government had given up on building new public housing for low-income families, and urban renewal programs were not required to locate new homes for those whom it displaced. And so the poor and the homeless are going to be immediately affected by this. Now, in reality, there were three things that are going on here. One is what I refer to as occupational displacement, which I referred to earlier. And that is that for people being laid off in the 80s, most of those, or I should say many of those people, were not simply being laid off. They were being let go. Their job was being eliminated. And this was most affected blue-collar workers. And the reason for that is the automobile industry finally had to wake up and update and upgrade its technological use in the assembly line in order to make their cars more competitive vis-a-vis Japanese and European cars and Korean cars. And this resulted in a lot of automation that eliminated a very large number of workers that were required under heavy industry. And these are people who didn't have college degrees. These are people who did not have any kind of vocational training outside of their regular job. And so these are people who are going to find themselves in a very dire economic reality. And there was quite honestly nothing in place to help that. The second was something called deinstitutionalization. So in the 1970s, the country became aware of the just horrific abuses of the mentally ill in government-run institutions, namely state mental hospitals. There was a novel in the late 60s and a film, it was also a film called One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest. And this tweaked Americans' interest on this issue. A journalist, Geraldo Rivera, snuck into a New York State mental institution and took hidden cameras in and recorded just horrific scenes of abuse. Absolutely haunting moaning of people who are chained to beds and people sitting in their own filth and just emaciated bodies. And it was nightmarish to look at. And so this drove a reform, quote unquote, movement to change this. And deinstitutionalization came about because a lot of people in the psychiatric field and other reformers believed that many of the people in these institutions, and the reason why the populations rose so much, actually, was from the increased hard drug use that was prevalent in the 60s and the 70s, namely heroin and LSD and other very heavy psychotropic drugs. And so the belief was, well, if we put them on methadone and other types of psychopharmacal products, well, they would be normal and they could just, live normal lives, so you could take them out of the institution, hence deinstitutionalization. The problem with that is, with many people who suffer from psychotic conditions, once they're healthy, they can begin to feel like they don't need the medicine anymore. And because there was no way of enforcing these outpatient procedures, a number of people fell through the cracks. I mean, and I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are just not going to show up for their treatments, and then all of a sudden they have a psychotic episode, they lose their housing, they're on the street, and there you have it. The third thing is something called regentrification. So A lot of the inner cities had turned into slums. It was either, as I just stated, federally funded and state-funded public housing, or it was just run-down old buildings. And this urban blight becomes an issue in the 1980s, really starting in the late 70s, but definitely in the early 80s. What had happened was a number of those hippies who were stoned and having a great time decided that they needed to clean up and get a life. And so the hippies became yuppies, which stood for Young Urban Professionals. And what they did is they rejected the suburbia of their youth and they rediscovered the inner city. And these were old, Gilded Age, or what you might think of as Victorian period buildings in cute little neighborhoods all over the cities of America. And they were just run down. And so these were buildings that were available at pennies on the dollar. And so these yuppies swooped in, and in my area where I am, which is in San Diego, California, there's an area downtown called the Gas Lamp, and this is what happened there. In the 80s, an association was formed of young urban professionals who decided to save these quote-unquote historic buildings and turned them into beautiful shops and restaurants and nightclubs and, little bed and breakfasts and hostels for young travelers. I mean, it's just really beautiful little spaces. Problem? Poor people were living in them. They were the only places where the poor people could afford to have a home. And these people become displaced, adding to the homeless problem. I mean, it became a real, genuine nightmare. So, in addition to that, there was a discovery of what was called the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. And it brought to the forefront of society the risk of unprotected homosexual relations and drug use, particularly intravenous drug use. Originally thought of as a gay disease, AIDS emerged as one of the nation's greatest healthcare problems. Reagan really ignores this, starting in 1981 when the quote-unquote first diagnosis happens. Reagan chose not to really address it publicly, and because it was seen as a gay disease, and the moral majority that supported Reagan wanted nothing to do with it. In fact, some were just downright evil in their assessment. Pat Buchanan, who's going to run for the nomination in 1992, if I remember correctly, said that this was nature's way of punishing unnatural acts. I mean, this is just horrific rhetoric. So Reagan tried to stay away from it. But then Cary Grant, who most of you young people will have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, but Cary Grant was a heartthrob of the golden age of Hollywood for starring with people like Debbie Reynolds and Katharine Hepburn and Myrna Loy. I mean, he was an incredibly popular, tall, handsome, funny, just an amazing actor. And lo and behold, he had been living a closeted life and had contracted AIDS. And he was a very, very close friend of the Reagans. And so this, in my opinion, pushed the Reagans into the debate. And Nancy Reagan does something that was, I think, more important than her husband. She invites Cary Grant to the White House. They meet him. They have these things. And we see the First Lady touching an AIDS patient, which I realize may not sound like very much to us today. But back then, when many AIDS patients were completely quarantined and had no human touch whatsoever, this was a phenomenal thing. And so it was unfortunate because it really took a major thing to have happen. And so we get to this idea of Reagan's legacy, and it has really evolved just in the short time since his departure. When he left office in 1989, I would say that the vast majority of the media were kind of like happy to see him leave. There were many people who just felt that he was an empty suit and kind of like Eisenhower with less intelligence. I mean, there are all sorts of very, I would say, snarky assessments of Reagan. But in the period since he has left office. A lot of historians have proven to be more generous. Now, I have to give full disclosure. Ronald Reagan is the first person I ever voted for because I wasn't eligible. I turned 21 after the 1980 election, so I couldn't participate in that one. So, I took a lot of pride in voting for the first time, but more importantly, I felt that Reagan was the best choice. Again, like I said earlier, Walter Mondale to me just seemed like an absolute nobody. I mean, he was just not very thrilling of a candidate. It's just very hard to kind of get on his bandwagon. But I think that Reagan deserves some credit and not so much in other areas. On the economy, I don't believe that Reagan can get credit for the amazing growth of the 1980s on his own. I believe that some of the critics are correct, that Reagan was, in a sense, quote unquote, lucky, that certain things happened at the same time. The one that I think is the most important thing that was lucky for him was what's referred to as the oil glut. So we've talked in the previous units about the energy crisis and the oil embargo and how American energy prices just like catapulted into the stratosphere. Well, no credit to Reagan or anyone in the West. OPEC overplayed their hands. OPEC was a cartel, so that's a group of people behaving like a monopoly. And this is why I'm one of these people who say, leave monopolies alone because they destroy themselves. And here we see it perfect. The OPEC countries thought that they had the whole world by the throat. And so they just continued to hike prices as high as they thought they could. They reaped unbelievable windfalls of cash. Americans had all kinds of images and motifs of rich Arab guys, traipsing around American cities and buying up buildings and, spending it on women and booze, even though they were Muslims. And I mean, it was just this, kind of like ongoing motif. And the problem with that is oil exists in a lot of places besides the OPEC countries, America being one of the largest ones. The only reason why OPEC was in the oil business is because it was cheaper to get the oil and easier to get the oil out of their countries than it was to get it out of other places. So when OPEC decided to just hold the world hostage with these amazingly high prices, they made it cost effective for other oil producers to go into the oil business. So Mexico is going to revive its oil. The United States is going to revive its oil industry in places like Alaska and Oklahoma and Texas. The United States is not going to be alone there. Canada is going to revive its oil industry. England is going to get into the oil market with sources in the North Sea. Norway is going to open its oil business. Russia is going to utilize this to try to help it revive its economy. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go in there. And what happens? An oil glut. All of a sudden, the world is just swimming in oil. And in the meantime, people all over the world, but particularly in the West, everybody had learned how to cut back on their oil consumption. They had cut back their electric use. They cut back on their car gas mileage. They had done all these different things. So the demand and the supply fell back into balance, and gas prices plummeted. Well, if you took my tax cut at the time and now the cut in the cost of driving my car, I have an unbelievable amount of monthly additional income. And a lot of Americans just went out and went on a spending spree. And Reagan didn't have anything to do with that, but it just happened. But I do believe that Reagan got on board with what I refer to as shock therapy. He didn't follow the Keynesian model. Instead, he tried something different. And it worked, right? It shocked the system. Paul Volcker deserves a lot of credit for this. He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And even though Reagan wasn't 100% on board, he stepped aside and just allowed Volcker to jack up interest rates in the United States. And the combination of all of that just literally snuffed out inflation. And to be quite honest, we have not seen any sign of massive inflation since the middle 1980s. And that is just an unbelievable thing. So now, under the area of foreign affairs, we have another situation that I think has to be balanced, right? Did Ronald Reagan pick Mikhail Gorbachev to be the premier of the Soviet Union? No, absolutely not, right? So Gorbachev's willingness to take the risk and commit his country to massive cutbacks in weaponry has nothing to do with Reagan whatsoever. However, I do believe that Reagan pushed the Soviet Union into that scenario. Our intelligence for a long time had been showing that the Soviet economy was collapsing on its own. Well, that information had been available since the 70s. So Nixon knew that, Ford knew that, Carter knew that. Reagan took advantage of it. He essentially said to the Soviet Union, oh, your economy's horrible? Well, let's see if you can keep up with all of this. And just embarked on a $2 trillion credit card binge on weapons. And I struggled with this. And what I tell students all the time is what I ended up having to do here is, and it just happened at a fluid conversation in one of my graduate courses. And people were talking about this horrible debt of $2 trillion, and it was useless spending because most of the weapons were just trashed, and it was all borrowed money, and it was horrible, and just what a waste, and all this other stuff. And then for whatever reason, the thought entered my head, how many people thought that the Cold War would end? I know I never did. I mean, it never entered my mind that there would actually be an end to the Cold War. And never in my head did I think that there would ever be a fall of the Berlin Wall or the reunification of Germany. I never thought any of that would happen. And if I did contemplate it, it was under a scenario where millions and millions of people would be killed from some sort of nuclear disaster or catastrophe. Some wild-eyed, weirdo from either the West or the East would just launch a missile and just, wreak havoc. And suddenly I just sort of said, you know what? To end the Cold War and reunite Europe without anybody dying a horrific death, I'm kind of okay with $2 trillion. And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but that's kind of where I've come down. He tripled the debt. But by tripling the debt, he actually ended the Cold War, reunited Europe, without killing millions of people. Wow. I guess I'm kind of okay. And this brings us to 1988. Reagan obviously can't run for a third term. So he gives his blessing, let's say, to his vice president, George H.W. Bush, to run for office. Now, as you can see by this map, George H.W. Bush does amazingly well. I mean, people for a long time kind of thought of George Bush as this kind of like loser. But if you look at the figures here, he doesn't do bad. I mean, he does kind of hold out pretty good. And so now, so now Reagan sort of helps nominate Bush. And the Democrats nominated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. And to just kind of be straightforward about it, Dukakis was just a terrible campaigner. he just misread so many political cues. It was just sort of tragic. And Bush was able to win a solid victory in 1988. And as you can see, he carries California. He was from Texas. And he will be the last Republican to carry California up until now. This presentation is being put together in 2019. And as of today, and in 2020, I don't see a Republican winning California by any stretch. So, Bush 1 really kind of conquers all the way through there. So now the Bush administration, he really falls under a problem. And it's interesting. George H.W. Bush is the first sitting president to be elected president since Martin Van Buren in 1836. And there's a scary kind of similarity. Martin Van Buren's predecessor was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was insanely popular among the let's just say the mainstream population, but he was despised by the elite. Reagan was very much the same. Reagan was incredibly popular with mainstream America, but the elites in the media and in the political system really just couldn't stand him. And both Martin Van Buren and George H.W. Bush were incredibly supportive vice presidents and were dutifully obedient to their president, even when they disagreed. And both of these men were made president only to face the sort of blowback from all of the bad decisions and scandals of the previous administration. And this is really no different for Bush. And Bush's biggest domestic problem was the size of the national debt. And he wanted to wage war on illegal drugs. He actually appoints a quote-unquote drug czar, William Bennett. And this just weighs him down. He had made a promise in the 1988 election to never support any increases in revenue, and a famous line that he says, "No new taxes." And the Democrats who controlled the Congress essentially play what I think is a brilliant political move, but something that has long-term ramifications for budget process. They basically tell the president, look, we're not going to give you a budget unless you agree to higher taxes. And so the president caves, signs on to the higher taxes, and then the Democrats go out and tell the American people, see, George Bush lied to you. He said no new taxes, and here he promised us new taxes. And that really is what's going to destroy George Bush's chances of being reelected. Now, on the more positive side, the drop of the Berlin Wall, as you can see happening here in November of 1989, sparks a democracy movement that has really just been all over the place, right? So during Bush's administration, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, and eventually East Germany are all going to break free of Soviet Union control. And although he was globally popular, Mikhail Gorbachev faced a coup in his own country when the KGB decided that he was too weak and allowing the Soviet prestige to collapse. And he's going to be replaced by the Russian president Boris Yeltsin. And the key is here, so if I may for a moment, I would just like to say this is, I think, one of the best legacies of George H.W. Bush. He was a diplomat. He had been America's emissary to China. He was director of the CIA. He had been a congressman. He had an incredible resume going into office after 8 years as vice president. And he approached it in what I would have to say was a more humble manner than Reagan, which I think hurt him. He himself said, I'm not real good on the quote-unquote vision thing. And however, when the Berlin Wall was coming down, and I remember this quite distinctly because I happened to be in Germany at the time, in Frankfurt, visiting friends, and we weren't able to get to Berlin because it was such a cluster of people celebrating the fall of the wall. And there were people in the White House at the time who wanted George Bush to fly to Berlin and to basically do a victory dance, to essentially, dance on the grave of the Soviet system. And he refuses. He orders everybody, no gloating, no public, defamation, no effort at all to rub the Soviet nose in it or anything, because Bush just didn't like that. That wasn't his style, and he thought that it would be unbecoming of the country. That's just incredible to me when I think about that. And the same is going to hold true in 1991 when Gorbachev is taken hostage by the KGB, and the Soviet Union literally falls apart in 1991. Again, George Bush doesn't do anything. He doesn't gloat. He simply encourages the people to do the best they can and to be peaceful and to bring about positive change. And when that comes to Russia, Bush just sits down and meets with Yeltsin, the new leader, and they agree to dramatic reduction in the number of nuclear stockpiles. And so, this is, I'm sorry, this is just an unbelievably wonderful thing for the world when he does this. And it led to, I believe, a very peaceful transition from a Cold War to this sadly short period of global peace. Now, Bush is going to send troops to Panama in 1989 to overthrow Manuel Noriega, a dictator. And in 1983, he had become the leader of Panama through a military takeover. And he started to use his connections to run drugs and arms into the United States. He was acting as an FBI informant on other drug smugglers. And then we found out that he was doing that so that he could get rid of his competition and corner more of the drug market. And so there was essentially a warrant for his arrest. He refused to turn himself in. And when he basically challenged George Bush, who he thought he was a weakling, to come and get him or shut up, he went and got him. And he was basically captured within a day. Now, in August of 1990, Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait. And Bush is going to send troops into Saudi Arabia to defend that nation from a similar attack, something called Operation Desert Shield. Bush, again, in my opinion, deftly went in, figured out how to put together a coalition of over 40-some countries, including Arabs, and got the UN to demand that Iraq evacuate Kuwait. And when Saddam Hussein refused to do that, in January of 1991, a coalition of forces made up about 30 nations attacked Iraq and drove it out of Kuwait. And it was literally 1,000 hours of fighting. It was just 6 weeks of war, and it was over. And Saddam Hussein was out. U.S. forces had not only cleared out Kuwait, but pushed the Iraqi army into the far northern half of Iraq. And it was over. And it was just an amazing period. And if you have read in the text, Bush's approval rating in 1991 rose to 91%. And it's just phenomenal. Within a year, he's going to lose an election to Bill Clinton. And that's where we're going to start in the next chapter, is where we're going to have a conversation about the fall of George H.W. Bush and a rise of the new Democratic Leadership Conference, or DLC, under President Bill Clinton.